What most people misunderstand about avoidance is this idea that they leave because they don't feel enough. That's the surface level story. It's convenient, it's clean, and it protects their image. But if you look deeper, psychologically, emotionally, you start to see a very different mechanism at play. Avoidants don't pull away because they feel too little. They pull away because they feel too much, and they don't know how to regulate it. When an empath enters their life, something unusual happens. The empath doesn't just interact, they see. They notice subtleties, they read emotional undercurrents, they respond with depth. And for someone who has spent most of their life keeping emotions compartmentalized, this kind of presence is disarming. It disrupts their internal order. It brings feelings to the surface that they've trained themselves to suppress or ignore. Now here's where the illusion of control comes in. Avoidants build their identity around independence, self-sufficiency, and emotional distance. It's not just a preference, it's a survival strategy. So when the empath begins to create emotional closeness, the avoidant doesn't interpret that as safety. They interpret it as a loss of control. And the human mind will always prioritize control over connection if it believes connection threatens stability. So what do? They create distance. Not because the empath isn't valuable, but because the empath is too valuable, too impactful, too capable of getting past their defenses. And instead of saying, this connection is meaningful but overwhelming, they translate that discomfort into a simpler narrative. Maybe I'm just not that into this person. That thought isn't truth. It's regulation. It's a psychological maneuver to reduce intensity. Because if they admitted the depth of what they feel, they would also have to confront vulnerability, dependency, and the possibility of loss. And those are precisely the experiences they've spent years avoiding, so they withdraw early, they detach. Sometimes they become cold, distant, even dismissive. And to the empath, it feels confusing, even hurtful, because the connection was real. But from the avoidant's internal perspective, they're restoring equilibrium. They're trying to get back to a place where they feel in control of themselves. What's important to understand here is that this isn't a conscious strategy most of the time. It's patterned behavior, conditioned responses rooted in past experiences where emotional closeness may have felt unsafe, overwhelming, or unpredictable. So when something genuine appears, their system doesn't recognize it as an opportunity. It recognizes it as a threat. And here's the paradox. The very thing they're trying to avoid, emotional intensity, is exactly what makes the connection meaningful. But because they exit too early, they never fully process that meaning in real time. They suppress it, delay it, and push it out of awareness, which sets the stage for everything that follows. Because when you walk away from something that mattered without fully understanding why it mattered, your mind doesn't just let it go. It stores it, it lingers, and eventually it comes back, not as clarity, but as confusion, curiosity, and unresolved desire. And that's where the story really begins, because what they thought they controlled was never actually under control at all. And once that distance is created, once the empath is no longer there to offer that presence, that attention, that emotional clarity, something subtle but powerful begins to happen inside the avoidant. At first, it feels like relief. Space returns. The pressure fades. They can breathe again, think clearly, reestablish their sense of independence, and for a moment, it reinforces their belief that leaving was the right decision. But that relief doesn't last. Because what they've actually removed isn't just a person. It's an entire emotional environment. The empath didn't just love them. They created a space where the avoidant could exist without pretense, where they were understood without having to explain themselves fully. That kind of experience doesn't register immediately in the avoidant's mind because they're not wired to process emotions in real time. But once it's gone, the contrast becomes undeniable. Silence has a way of revealing what noise was hiding. In the absence of the empath, there's no one reflecting their inner world back to them. No one softening their edges. No one intuitively responding to the things they don't say out loud. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the avoidant begins to feel something unfamiliar. Not intensity this time, but emptiness. A kind of emotional flatness that wasn't there before. This is where the mind starts to replay. Moments they dismissed suddenly resurface. Conversations that felt ordinary now carry weight. The empath's patience, their warmth, their consistency, things that once felt excessive or even suffocating begin to take on a different meaning. Not because the past has changed, but because the avoidance perspective has shifted in the absence of that experience. And here's the psychological mechanism at work. The brain is trying to resolve a mismatch. On one hand, they told themselves this wasn't that important. On the other hand, their emotional system is now signaling something valuable is missing. That contradiction creates tension, and the only way to resolve it is to reassess the past. So they start to reinterpret the connection. What they once minimized, they now magnify. What they once avoided, they now feel drawn toward. And this isn't nostalgia in the romantic sense, it's cognitive and emotional recalibration. The avoidant is beginning to feel what they couldn't feel before because the intensity is no longer immediate. It's distant, filtered, safer to process. But there's a catch. Because they didn't process these emotions with the empath, they're now experiencing them without context. There's no dialogue, no shared understanding, no opportunity to ground those feelings in reality. So what emerges is often idealized, incomplete, even distorted. They don't just remember the empath, they reconstruct them, sometimes into something even more significant than what they allowed themselves to see before. And that's where the emotional echo becomes powerful. It's not just that they miss the person, they miss the feeling of being in that person's presence, the way their world felt more alive, more connected, more meaningful. And because that feeling is no longer accessible, it grows in perceived value. Absence doesn't just make the heart grow fonder. It makes the mind search for answers it didn't care to find before. So the avoidant, who once needed distance to feel in control, now finds themselves pulled by something they can't easily control at all. A quiet, persistent awareness that what they walked away from may have been more significant than they allowed themselves to believe. And by the time they begin to truly understand that, the silence has already done its work. And when that awareness starts to build, when the absence turns into curiosity and curiosity turns into a pull, you might expect the avoidant to come back with clarity, with emotional honesty, maybe even with an apology that matches the depth of what they're beginning to feel. But that's not usually how it shows up. What often returns first is not love. It's not vulnerability. It's desire. Because for the avoidant, desire feels manageable. It's focused, it's immediate, and most importantly, it doesn't require full emotional exposure. Lust becomes a kind of bridge, one that allows them to reconnect without stepping into the very space that overwhelmed them in the first place. You have to understand, emotional intimacy and physical attraction are processed very differently in the avoidant mind. Emotional intimacy asks for openness, consistency, and a willingness to be seen over time. It requires them to lower defenses that have been carefully built, sometimes over years. That's high risk in their internal system. Physical attraction, on the other hand, operates in a contained space. It's intense, but it's temporary. It doesn't demand long-term vulnerability. It allows them to feel connected in the moment without having to confront the deeper layers that come with sustained closeness. So when they reappear, it can feel confusing to the empath. There's energy again, there's attention, there's even a kind of passion that may not have been fully expressed before. And it's easy to interpret that as growth, as if the avoidant has finally recognized the value of the connection. But in many cases, what they're actually doing is engaging in the safest form of closeness available to them. Lust creates an illusion of intimacy without the responsibility of it. It allows them to be near you without being fully with you, to experience the emotional high without committing to the emotional depth. And because the empath naturally connects through both emotional and physical channels, this can feel like a continuation of something meaningful. But for the avoidant, it's often a controlled environment, one where they can step in and out without losing their sense of autonomy. There's also another layer to this. When the avoidant begins to revisit the connection, they're not just responding to the person, they're responding to the unresolved emotional imprint. The feelings they couldn't process before are still there, but instead of expressing them directly, they get redirected into physical desire. It's a translation mechanism. The intensity is real, but the language is different. And this is where many people misread the situation. They think if the attraction is this strong, it must mean something deeper. And it can, but only if it's accompanied by emotional accountability, by presence, by a willingness to engage beyond the surface. Without that, desire alone becomes a loop. It pulls you in, gives you a glimpse of connection, and then disappears again when the deeper layers start to surface. Because eventually, even lust leads back to intimacy. And when it does, the same discomfort that caused them to leave the first time begins to rise again. So they retreat. or they create inconsistency, or they keep the connection in a space where it never fully evolves, not because they're trying to deceive, but because this is the only way they know how to stay connected without feeling overwhelmed. And if you don't recognize that pattern, you can mistake intensity for intention. But the truth is, real connection requires more than desire. It requires the courage to remain present when things are no longer easy, no longer controlled, no longer safe in the way they once were. And until that shift happens, what looks like passion is often just protection in disguise. And beneath that cycle of distance and return, beneath the confusion of desire without depth, there's another force at play, one that's quieter but often more powerful than anything else driving the avoidance behavior. It's the ego. Not ego in the sense of arrogance or superiority, but ego as identity. The internal image a person holds about who they are, how they're perceived, and how they maintain a sense of psychological stability. Because when an empath enters an avoidance life, something very specific happens. The empath doesn't just connect, they validate. They reflect back parts of the avoidant that are rarely acknowledged. The guarded parts, the misunderstood parts, the parts they themselves don't fully engage with. And for a while, that feels stabilizing. It feels grounding, even if they don't consciously recognize it. But here's the part that often goes unnoticed. The avoidant becomes accustomed to being seen in a way they've never experienced before. Not chased, not demanded, not judged, just understood. And that creates a kind of internal alignment. For a moment, they feel more complete, not because the empath fixed them, but because the empath created a space where they didn't have to fragment themselves to feel accepted. Now, when they walk away, they don't just lose the person, they lose that reflection. And this is where the ego gets activated in a very specific way. Because the avoidant has told themselves a story. I'm independent. I don't need deep emotional connection. I function better on my own. That identity feels solid until it's tested by absence. When the empath is gone and that sense of being deeply understood disappears with them, something starts to destabilize. They begin to feel a subtle but persistent dissonance. Not necessarily, I miss them, but more like, something about me felt different when they were around. And that realization challenges the ego's narrative. Because if they truly didn't need that connection, why does its absence feel like a loss of self, not just a loss of other? This is where the ego wound forms. It's not just about losing someone they cared about. It's about losing access to a version of themselves that only existed within that connection. A version that felt more open, more expressive, more understood. And once that version disappears, they're left with a comparison they can't ignore. What they were versus what they are now. And the mind doesn't like unresolved gaps like that. So it starts searching for resolution. Sometimes that shows up as curiosity, checking in, reaching out, reinitiating contact. Other times it shows up as restlessness, an inability to fully invest in new connections because something about them doesn't feel as real, as grounded as what they experienced before. And here's where it gets even more complex, because the avoidant may not consciously recognize that what they're responding to is an ego disruption. They might frame it as attraction, as chemistry, as unfinished business. But underneath all of that is a deeper question they haven't fully articulated. Why did I feel more like myself with that person than I do without them? That question carries weight because it forces them to confront something they've avoided for a long time. That connection didn't weaken them, it revealed them. And losing that revelation creates a kind of internal imbalance. So when they look back at the empath, they're not just seeing someone they once knew. They're seeing a mirror they no longer have access to. A mirror that showed them something real, something unfiltered, something they didn't have to perform to maintain. And that's not easy to replace. Because most interactions in life don't go that deep. Most people don't look that closely. Most connections don't hold that kind of emotional clarity. So the loss lingers, not always loudly, not always consciously, but consistently enough to shape their behavior in ways they don't fully understand. And that's why the pull remains, not just toward the person, but toward the experience of being seen without resistance, without effort, without defense. Because once you've been understood at that level, going back to being unseen doesn't feel neutral. It feels like losing a part of who you are. And just when you think you understand the pattern, distance, silence, desire, the pull of the past, there's another layer that explains why this cycle feels so delayed, so mistimed, almost as if it's operating on a completely different clock. Because in many ways, it is. Avoidants don't process emotions in real time. They process them in retrospect. When they're inside the relationship, when the connection is active, present, and asking something of them, their focus isn't on feeling. It's on managing. Managing expectations, managing closeness, managing the subtle pressure that comes with being emotionally engaged. Their attention is directed toward maintaining equilibrium, not exploring depth. So while the empath is experiencing the relationship as it unfolds, feeling, interpreting, responding in the moment, the avoidant is often one step removed, intellectually aware but emotionally buffered. It's not that they're disconnected from reality, it's that they're disconnected from the full impact of that reality while it's happening. And that has consequences, because emotions that aren't processed don't disappear. They get stored, they wait. So when the relationship ends, something shifts. The external pressure is gone. There's no longer a need to regulate closeness because closeness itself is no longer present. And in that space where there's no immediate demand, no perceived threat, the emotional system begins to open. What was once suppressed starts to surface. But now it's happening in a completely different context. There's distance. There's silence. There's no shared experience to anchor those feelings. So the avoidant begins to feel things they couldn't access before, but without the ability to act on them in a grounded, timely way. This is the delayed reaction, and it can be intense, because what they're experiencing isn't just a single emotion, it's an accumulation. Moments they didn't fully register, feelings they minimized, attachments they downplayed. All of it begins to converge, often all at once. And because it's happening after the fact, it carries a kind of urgency that wasn't there before. Now they start to question. Did I leave too soon? Was that more meaningful than I allowed myself to believe? Why does this feel heavier now than it did then? These questions don't come from clarity. They come from contrast. The difference between emotional numbness during the connection and emotional awareness after it ends creates a kind of internal shock. And here's where timing becomes critical. Because by the time the avoidant begins to access these feelings, the empath is often no longer in the same place. They've processed the loss in real time. They've felt the confusion, the hurt, the absence, and they've started to move forward. Not necessarily because it was easy, but because they didn't delay their emotional experience. So now you have two people who were once connected, existing in completely different emotional timelines. One is just beginning to feel what the other has already worked through. And that creates a powerful, often frustrating dynamic because when the avoidant reaches out, when they try to reconnect, to revisit, to re-engage, it's not necessarily coming from manipulation or indecision. It's coming from a genuine emotional realization that arrived too late. But timing matters because awareness without alignment doesn't restore connection. It complicates it. The empath, who once waited for clarity, may no longer need it. The space that once felt empty is now filled with growth, perspective, and a different kind of stability. And what the avoidant is offering, though real, no longer fits into the same emotional landscape. So what you're witnessing isn't just a missed opportunity. It's a misaligned awakening, a moment where one person finally understands the depth of something, just as the other has learned how to live without it. And that's the cost of delayed emotion. Because when you wait too long to feel something real, you don't just risk losing the connection. You risk losing the moment where that connection could have actually mattered. And when you take all of this together, the distance, the silence, the delayed emotion, the return through desire, the quiet ego disruption, you start to see a deeper truth emerge. Because what the avoidant is drawn back to isn't always just the empath as a person. It's the experience of who they became in that connection. This is the part that's rarely acknowledged, but it's often the most powerful. Every meaningful relationship doesn't just connect you to someone else. It introduces you to a version of yourself that only exists within that dynamic. And with an empath, that version tends to be more open, more expressive, more emotionally alive. Not because the empath is changing them, but because the environment allows parts of them to surface that are usually kept hidden. So when the avoidant reflects on the past, they're not just remembering conversations or moments. They're remembering a state of being, a version of themselves that felt different, maybe calmer, maybe more understood, maybe even more authentic than what they experience in their day-to-day life. And once that comparison is formed, it's difficult to ignore. Because now the question isn't just, do I miss this person? It becomes, why did I feel more like myself when I was with them? That's a much deeper question. And it doesn't have a simple answer, because the truth is the empath didn't create that version of them. They revealed it. They provided a space where defenses weren't constantly activated, where emotional expression didn't feel like a risk, where presence replaced performance. And in that space, the avoidant accessed something real. But here's where the confusion begins. When they feel the pull to return, they often attribute it entirely to the person. I miss them. I want them back. And part of that may be true, but underneath that desire is something more nuanced. They miss the experience of themselves within that relationship. And that distinction matters, because if they don't recognize it, they can end up chasing the person without addressing the pattern that caused them to leave in the first place. They try to recreate the feeling without changing the internal structure that made that feeling unsustainable. So they come back hoping to reconnect with that version of themselves. But unless there's awareness, unless there's growth, the same defenses will eventually resurface. The same discomfort with closeness, the same need for control, the same instinct to withdraw when things become too real. And the cycle repeats, not because the connection wasn't meaningful, but because it was, and they didn't know how to hold it. For the empath, this can be one of the most difficult things to understand. Because from their perspective, the connection was genuine, consistent, and emotionally grounded. So when the avoidant returns, it can feel like validation, as if everything they felt is finally being recognized. But recognition without transformation doesn't create stability. Because what the avoidant is longing for isn't just the relationship, it's the feeling that relationship gave them. And feelings on their own are not enough to sustain something long-term. They have to be supported by awareness, by emotional capacity, by the willingness to stay present even when the intensity rises. Otherwise, the connection becomes a memory they revisit, not a reality they can maintain. And this is where clarity becomes essential. Because not every return is an invitation to rebuild. Sometimes it's simply a reflection of unresolved internal conflict. A moment where someone is drawn back to what felt real. Not because they're ready to meet it fully, but because they haven't yet learned how to create that reality within themselves. And until that happens, the past will always feel more complete than the present. So when you look at the full picture, what seems like longing for another person is often something deeper, something more personal, more internal. It's the desire to reconnect with a version of yourself that you only briefly allowed yourself to become. And the real question isn't whether you can find that again in someone else. It's whether you're willing to become that version of yourself and stay there. So when you step back and look at the entire pattern, it stops being a mystery and starts becoming a sequence. The avoidant doesn't ignore the empath because there's nothing there. They pull away because there's too much there. They create distance to feel in control, only to discover in that distance that something meaningful has been lost. The silence amplifies what they suppressed. The absence forces reflection. And when they return, it's often through the safest doorway they know. Desire. Because true emotional vulnerability still feels like unfamiliar territory. But underneath all of it, beneath the lust, the curiosity, the delayed realizations, and the ego disruption, is a deeper truth they can't easily escape. They're not just drawn back to the empath, they're drawn back to the version of themselves that existed in that connection. The openness, the emotional clarity, the sense of being understood without effort. That experience leaves an imprint, and once it's felt, it can't be fully forgotten. The challenge is that realization often comes late, after the moment has passed, after the empath has already done the work.